If you're a real cowboy, prove it on my stallion, says the widow. 25 men failed, he won. Before we begin, take a moment to comment your city. Where are you watching from tonight? And when the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Now settle into a quiet place, breathe deep, and let the whispers of the Wild West carry you into tonight's tale. The early wind sighed through the canyon, carrying with it the faint smoke of last night's fire and the warm scent of worn saddle leather. The year was 1870, late in that restless decade of the 19th century. Out here, where grasslands met red rock ridges, hoofbeats served as clocks and oil lamps stood in for the moon. Folks called this land Dry Creek Valley. That morning, silver dew clung to barbed wire, the ground cracked like fingerprints of the desert, and the silence was so deep you could almost hear it, the kind of silence that belongs to the West just before a story begins. On the wooden porch of the ranch house, Catherine Sterling stood tall. A widow, 3 years now, she had run a spread so wide she couldn't ride its fences down in a single day. Her hair was the color of autumn maple leaves tied neatly at the nape. Her eyes gray-blue, like a winter sky, steady but never cold. Folks called her hard. In truth, she had simply learned how to stand still in the wind. Beneath the porch, a lantern still burned golden, its small flame trembling with each draft, casting warmth across the rail, like a quiet promise that even in harshness, there remained a place where people could take shelter. Inside the corral stood a storm not yet spoken into song. Tempest, the black stallion, 17 hands tall, with a coat dark as midnight water and a mane like threads of shadow. Muscles rippled under his hide with each breath, pale vapor spilling into the cold morning light. They said no man was meant to ride him. 25 cowboys had tried bringing their grit and their tricks, their leather and their spurs, their shouts and their lashes, and everyone had been thrown to the dust ribs, bruised and pride broken. But Tempest wasn't cruel. He simply refused to be broken. Catherine knew that. For in the days when her husband was alive, there had been 10 sacred minutes when man and horse had moved together as though sharing one breath, one chest. Rumor spread like fire in sagebrush. If you're a real cowboy, prove it on my stallion. 10 minutes, $50 in gold. In the West, $50 could buy a new beginning. But Catherine wasn't looking for a man who could buy Tempest. She was waiting for the one Tempest would choose. The town whispered, some called her heartless. Others claimed the horse was cursed. And the children counted broken saddles the way they counted broken dreams. Miles away, in a gray line shack, a man warmed his leather gloves by a coal fire. Coffee scorched at the edge of the pot. Wood cracked and popped, and shadows clung to the brim of his hat. Jake Morrison, so used to silence that it no longer frightened him. He worked the far corners of the double bar, mending fences, chasing wolves, nursing sick cattle. The war had left hollows in him words could not fill. Only horses understood. They did not lie. They did not scheme. They did not abandon a man for holding the wrong opinion. The tale of a black stallion no rider could master reached Jake on the wind. He came not for gold nor for glory. Sometimes a man must ride out to answer his own question. That morning, he saddled Copper. His steady bay tied a coil of rawhide behind the cantle, slipped a pouch of hardtack and coffee into his saddlebag, and closed the shack door. In the east, the sky split into a thin blade of light. The prairie shifted from slate gray to honey gold. Birds skimmed low over a dry creek bed. Along the trail, Jake listened to the west's soft murmur wind dragging across tin roofs, mesquite limbs brushing each other the lone clink of a cowbell calling a forgotten name. At times, he stopped, resting his hand on Copper's neck, feeling the hot pulse beneath his skin, a ritual to remind them both they were not alone. At the valley's rim, the first sound was not of men, but of thunder trapped within wooden walls, Tempest circling hooves, striking dry earth dust, rising in small storms. From there, Jake saw Sterling Ranch, nestled in its hollow smoke, curling upward fences straight as the handwriting of a careful soul. From a distance, the valley itself looked like a prayer, open bare, demanding honesty from whoever entered. Jake tied Copper by the barn, touched the gelding's neck, a quiet, "We'll be all right," and walked toward the crowd. Western men's faces at dawn all bore the same marks: sun-leathered skin eyes, narrowed by glare and suspicion, jaws hardened by bargaining with land. They leaned against rails, hands buried in coat pockets, retelling falls and failures like talking about the weather. But when Jake stepped closer, the murmurs thinned. Not because they knew his name, but because Tempest lifted his head mane, flying like a dark banner, and suddenly all was still. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. From the porch, Catherine stepped down 2 boards, her hand brushing the post as if greeting an old friend. Her gaze met Jake's, steady and unblinking. No wasted words. In the West, people measured each other by how they stood inside silence. Jake touched his brim. No smile, no show. Just a simple gesture saying, "I come with respect." The corral gate creaked. Someone had tried before him or was about to. But Jake didn't climb the rail, didn't grab a rope. He walked to the fence and stood still, letting the stallion see him before he truly saw the stallion. The scents mingled around him: warm sandhorse sweat, sun-soaked timber, a slow, earthy perfume that calmed a man's heartbeat. Behind him, the porch lantern still burned its small flame, the one point of light his memory would carry when night returned. And then, as every Western tale meant to lull weary souls, must a quiet question rose to open the door of fate. When a man has forgotten how to trust, can a horse who still believes teach him how to begin again? From that moment on, Dry Creek Valley would witness a courage not born to conquer, but to listen. And by the rails of that wooden corral, 2 spirits began to draw near, inch by inch, like dawn easing over the prairie, unhurried yet certain. Part 1. Abandoned. The noonday sun scorched Dry Creek Valley, pouring down in a harsh white glare that left the land weary and bleached. A wind swept in from the south, carrying dry dust that lashed against the old wooden fences, making their planks groan, as though they were complaining. At the center of the valley, the corral had become the focus of every eye in town. Folks abandoned their fields, left their midday meals, and gathered here to watch a challenge that most believed was doomed. Around the rails stood men of every kind: farmers with sun-darkened faces, cowhands in faded checkered shirts, a few portly traders in worn vests. The women sat farther back, parasols lifted against the heat, caught between worry and curiosity. Children slipped through the gaps in the rails, climbing posts for a clearer view. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, of dry hay, and of rusted iron. Everyone waited for the black stallion Tempest, the so-called monster, to throw another rider. The man of the day called himself a professional. His name was Riker, from Kansas. He had arrived at dawn, with 2 assistants, boasting to anyone who would listen that he had won 3 rodeo titles. He moved through the crowd like a showman at a circus boot heels, striking hard spurs, flashing a brand new leather coat, creaking with each swaggering step. Some whispered, "Maybe this time Tempest will lose." But a few older men only chuckled. Out here, spurs might win you a crowd, but only a horse's heart will win you the ride. On the porch of the ranch house, Catherine Sterling stood a little higher than the rest, like an unseen judge. For 3 years since her husband's death, she had not missed a single attempt. Her eyes were neither warm nor cold, just still like a winter lake. Inside, the stillness was a quiet weariness few could see. Each time Tempest flung a man into the dirt, Catherine felt her heart abandoned once more. Tempest stood tall in the corral sunlight, glinting off his black coat like polished obsidian. Each breath rose in a cloud of pale vapor, fading at once into the dry wind. His ears flicked sharp and restless, catching every sound. This horse needed no whip to remember pain, no reins to remember betrayal. He had seen through men 25 times already. The gate groaned open. Riker stepped inside, lifting his hat to the crowd like an actor bowing on stage. Whistles pierced the air, a few cheers followed. He swung his rope in a wide circle, letting it glitter in the sun before snapping it back, showing off his skill. But Tempest never looked away. His eyes, dark as wet coal, saw through every trick. "All right then, Monster," Riker muttered, his voice edged with scorn. His boots struck sharp against the dry earth as he advanced. The moment the rope hissed through the air, Tempest exploded. He reared on his hind legs, hooves cutting the wind dust rising in choking clouds. His scream split the valley. Riker pulled hard on the rope, but the stallion's strength came like a storm condensed into flesh. In a heartbeat, Tempest twisted faster than lightning. The rope ripped free. Riker was lifted off the ground, and his body crashed against the fence. The wood shuddered and cracked. The crowd froze, then gasps and groans tumbled out in waves. For a moment, Riker lay still. The sun baked his face sweat, and dust streaking into mud. When he staggered up, eyes wild, one leg dragging, laughter broke loose around him. But it was not laughter of joy. It was laughter of scorn, disappointment, and release. In the West, boasting was a sin, and a fall before this horse was confession enough. Tempest stood in the center again, sides heaving. He did not charge, did not rage. He lifted his head high, mane whipping in the hot wind as if to say, "I only want the truth." His gaze swept the crowd, pausing for a moment on Catherine at the porch. She answered with the faintest nod, as though echoing her own thought. A boy of 10 tugged at his mother's hand and whispered, "Why do they keep making him do this?" She hushed him, pulling him back. But the small question unsettled more than a few grown men. For Tempest had done nothing wrong. He only turned away those who came with tricks and pride. It was men who forced and men who failed. Riker limped toward the gate boots, dragging in the dust. No hand reached out to help. He knew in the West, to fall before a horse was shame enough. No one wished to share it. A sudden gust tore through, snatching his hat to the ground. He did not stop to pick it up. He hobbled away until his shape melted into the crowd and was gone. The corral grew still again. The sun burned overhead, yet silence pressed heavier than before. Murmurs stirred. No man can master that horse. Maybe it truly is cursed. An old man with a silver beard, sitting on a chair by the fence, spoke softly, just loud enough for a few to hear. Not cursed. He's waiting for someone who speaks his language. Catherine heard. The words cut into her, as though brushing an old wound. She remembered how her husband had once ridden Tempest. He had not used, a whip, had not leaned on tricks. He had simply sat still, letting the horse breathe with him. And now, each time a man was thrown, Catherine felt herself abandoned again. Abandoned from the hope that somewhere there might still be a man true enough, quiet enough, patient enough for Tempest to choose. Another dry wind swept the valley, lifting red dust into the air. The crowd shielded their eyes, children coughed. And when the haze cleared, Tempest still stood, his shadow stretched long across the sand, like the shadow of a storm caged inside wooden rails. To many, he was a monster, but in Catherine's eyes, he was a mirror, reflecting the truth of men, reflecting the loneliness that she and the stallion both carried. The corral beneath the burning noon sun sank into silence once more. Only the wind sighing through the rails, the scrape of wood against wood, and the deep, heavy breath of a horse still waiting for a companion it could trust. Part 2. The stranger arrives. The western noon still melted the air, but after Riker's fall, the corral sank into a heavy silence. The crowd murmured in uneasy tones. Some drifted away, others lingered only to have something to retell at the saloon that night. Dust hung in the sunlight, the glare turning it into golden streaks that stung the eyes. At the edge of the yard, a man quietly tied his horse to a wooden post. No one noticed when he appeared. There were no whistles, no shouts. His bay-gelding copper stood still, ears flicking only to the familiar rhythm of its master's breath. The man did not rush. He slipped off his leather gloves and laid a hand on the horse's neck, a small, steadying touch. Simple though it was, those who watched closely could see it was the habit of someone who had lived long among the prairies, who knew that before any trial, the first duty was to calm the friend who carried you. Jake Morrison, his name the valley would remember, stepped into the dusty yard. His long coat carried the stain of road dust, his weathered hat shaded a face tanned and lined by the sun. No one knew who he was, nor where he had come from. It was his silence that unsettled the crowd, wiping away the laughter. In a world of bragging voices, sometimes silence speaks the loudest. On the porch, Catherine Sterling stood, her shadow stretching beneath the sun. She had grown used to cowboys who came and went to their confident smiles and their shameful falls. But her gaze lingered on this man a little longer. Not for his clothes, nothing stood out. Not for his looks, his face was marked more by hardship than beauty. It was the way he walked slow, unhurried, without boasting, without shrinking back. As if he already knew who he was, and that was enough to let him stand tall in a crowd. Jake stopped at the rail where Tempest waited. The black stallion turned his head, eyes glowing in the sunlight like embers in coal. The air tightened sharp as a drawn string. The crowd held its breath, expecting Jake to climb the fence, as others had done. But he didn't. Instead, he removed his hat and dipped his head, a gesture both respectful and humble, directed toward Catherine on the porch. "Are you here to try your luck with my horse?" Catherine's voice rang down clear and steady like a silver bell cutting through the heat. Jake pressed his hat to his chest, answering in a voice rough but warm. "Thinking about it, ma'am." The crowd chuckled. A few whistles broke out, convinced this was the start of another swaggering show. But Catherine kept her eyes on him as though peering past the dust to see into his soul. Many men thought the same. She said, her tone carrying a weary edge. Then they fell, leaving nothing but shame. "So what makes you different?" In another man's mouth, that question would invite boasting lists of victories, claims of skill. But Jake stood quiet. He looked down at the dust, then up at the black horse in the corral. Slowly, he spoke. "Can't say that I am, ma'am. I didn't come here to prove anything. Not to you, Not to this crowd, not even to myself. I just want to see if me and that horse can find a common ground." The crowd fell silent. No one had expected words like that. Every man before had spoken of proving strength, proving grit. But this man had come not to prove. Catherine blinked, and for the first time in many months, the corners of her mouth softened. Only a moment, but enough to stir a quiet surprise in her heart. In her gray-blue eyes, a faint light flickered, the kind of light long buried under the dust of loss. Tempest drew a deep breath, ears tilting toward Jake, as though he too was listening. A dry wind curled the dust into small spirals around the horse's legs, then scattered them away. For an instant, there was no laughter, no noise, only the shared breath of three souls: the stranger, the widow, and the storm in a horse's body. Jake set his hat back upon his head. His face held no show of feeling, but his voice carried a weary gentleness. "I don't promise a thing, only that I won't force him." Those words startled Catherine more than any boast could. Every man before had begun with promises that they would ride, that they would do what no one else could. But this man refused promise in order to keep truth. The silence stretched. Wind rattled a woman's parasol, snapping its cloth. At last, Catherine spoke her voice, softer now, touched with warmth. "Perhaps that is the difference." The crowd murmured in surprise. An old woman whispered, "She must have seen something in him." Jake gave no answer to gossip. He simply stood, hand resting on the post eyes, never leaving Tempest. His gaze held no hunger for conquest, only a quiet invitation. And in that moment, Catherine understood, perhaps for the first time in 3 years, that not every man came here to prove himself. Some came searching for a part of themselves they had lost. The sun poured dust into every corner of the yard, stretching shadows long and thin. And within that hazy light, Catherine felt a cool stream slip into her heart. Quiet, unlooked for, yet undeniable. She knew this moment was the beginning of something, though it had no name yet. Part 3. The Language of Trust. The midday wind began to ease, softening into dry currents that skimmed across the prairie. The sun still blazed, but the fence shadows stretched long like dark ink spilled across the sand. The crowd had thinned. Only a handful of patient souls remained to see what the stranger would do. No one truly expected anything new. They had grown used to failure. Yet this man, Jake Morrison, did not take the familiar path. He walked toward the fence and stopped where sunlight and shadow met. Instead of climbing over, he rested his hands lightly on the top rail, his eyes never leaving the black stallion. Tempest stood 10 paces away, his dark body powdered with gold dust, his long mane tossing with the wind. The horse's ears flicked forward and back, testing the man who had stepped into his space. Jake didn't raise his voice. He spoke low, just enough for the breeze to carry to the horse's ears. "Easy there, partner. I'm not in a hurry. Just want to stand here if you'll allow it." His tone was slow, rough yet warm, like the steady glow of a coal fire on a winter night, not roaring, just glowing, giving quiet comfort. The crowd behind him fell silent. A few raised their brows, puzzled. They had seen men whistle, shout, even offer sweets. But this man only stood and spoke as though greeting an old friend. Tempest drew in a breath, nostrils flaring, releasing white vapor into the noon air. He did not come closer, nor did he turn away. He simply stood, head slightly tilted as if listening. A boy perched on the rail whispered, "He's talking to the horse." His father hushed him, but his own eyes never looked away. Jake's voice went on steady, and even. You've seen plenty of men, haven't you? They came with whips, with ropes, with pride. I'm not here to take anything from you. I just want to know, if I stand here long enough, will you accept me? He did not move forward. His hands rested loose on the rail, his gaze steady on Tempest. Dust swirled around his boots, crept into his coat, but he made no move to brush it away. On the porch, Catherine held her breath. It had been so long since she'd seen a man choose to wait. The minutes dragged, stretched thin as hours. Some in the crowd muttered restless and left. But those who remained, a dozen at most, found themselves rooted. This silence was not empty. It was full of expectation. At last, Tempest took a step. Dry sand grated beneath his hoof. Just one step, but enough to draw a sharp breath from the watchers. The stallion lifted his head, eyes reflecting the figure of the man. Jake gave a slight nod. No reaching hand, no urging. "Good boy," he whispered. "I know. You're weary of men who only want to prove themselves. I've grown weary of that too. Truth is, I've nothing left to prove." Catherine heard every word, her heart tightening. The voice wasn't loud, wasn't dressed in pretty phrases, but it carried truth. And horses above all know truth. Tempest stepped again. 8 paces now. Dust rose around his hooves, catching the light like scattered gold. Jake remained still, shoulders relaxed, eyes calm. He was not here to conquer. He was willing to be measured. A sudden gust swept through, tossing Catherine's hair across her face. She clutched her sleeve, eyes locked on the scene. Fear mingled with a fragile hope inside her. It had been so long since she'd seen anyone speak to Tempest without forcing. Then Tempest stopped striking his hoof, twice against the ground. The sound drummed through the still air. Jake tilted his head, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I hear you. I won't move until you want me to." The crowd gaped. One man muttered, "He's waiting for the horse's permission." But no one laughed. For in the meeting of man and horse's eyes, there was something that silenced them all. Time stretched on, heavy and slow. Sunlight slanted, painting the dust in bright streaks. Jake stood unmoving, breath-steady gaze unwavering. At last, Tempest lowered his head, tilting slightly to the side, a small gesture, but one any horseman would know. A sign of cautious acceptance. Catherine raised her hand to her mouth. She knew that signal. Her husband had once stood like that, waiting until Tempest chose to come closer. And now, before her eyes, another man was doing the same. Jake dipped his head in, answer his voice, low and warm. "Thank you. I'll be here as long as you need. No forcing." The sun leaned westward, stretching shadows long. Horse and man, their outlines touched on the sand. The onlookers, though they could not explain it, felt a strange warmth spread. No noise rose, only respect growing like a silent circle around two souls, a man and the storm of a horse. Part 4. Into the circle. The wooden gate of the corral creaked long and low, like the sigh of generations of cowboys who had stepped across that boundary. Western noon had slipped toward afternoon, the harsh white glare softening into a heavy golden light that clung to the dust. Those who remained pressed closer to the rails, eyes tense, for they knew this moment usually ended in a hard fall. Jake Morrison paused at the threshold, his hand resting lightly on the timber, his eyes fixed on Tempest. The black stallion stood in the center, his shadow stretching long across the sand ears, twitching, half wary, half curious. The crowd held its breath. Whispers floated, "He'll climb in like the others." But he didn't. Jake removed his hat, brushed the dust from its brim, then settled it back on his head. He drew a long breath, chest rising slowly before stepping across the gate. No noise, no wasted motion. Just a man walking into the circle as though he were entering a chapel. The distance between him and the horse remained wide. He held it neither rushing forward nor feigning confidence. Each step pressed a deep, steady mark into the dry sand, like quiet vows made to himself. Tempest shifted black eyes glittering like dark mirrors, watching every move. By the fence, Catherine Sterling clasped her hands until her knuckles whitened. In her heart rose a strange feeling, not quite fear, but a trembling suspense, like hearing the final note of a song about to arrive. She found her own breath slowing, matching the pace of Jake's steps. The crowd was utterly silent. No talk, no laughter. Even the children were hushed. All sensed the air had changed. This was no longer a show of pride. It was a ritual. Jake stopped when only 6 paces lay between him and the stallion. He did not close the gap. His eyes met the horse's, not challenging, not bowing. Simply steady, as if to say, "I'm here. I'll wait." He raised his right hand, slightly, palm open, held at chest height. His voice was low even. "No forcing, friend. If you want, you can come. If not, I'll still be here." Tempest's breath flared, his body rippling under the sun. He stepped sideways, circling, testing. Hooves drummed a rhythm into the sand, raising a shiver through those watching. Jake turned with him, slow, careful, keeping the distance. Once he even stepped back, yielding space as though granting the horse the arena. The crowd's breathing became collective inhaling when the stallion drew near, exhaling when he moved away. But Jake's breath was steady, slow, like distant surf on a far shore. Whenever Tempest glanced his way, he neither flinched nor pressed. He stood rooted, a calm marker in the circle, letting the horse know no harm would come. A northern gust swept through, carrying the scent of hay and the sharp tang of manure. Jake's dusty coat clung to his shoulders, sweat salted his lips beneath the brim of his hat. For a moment, time stretched thin, pulled taut as wire. Tempest stopped facing him. Only 5 paces now. His eyes, dark and fathomless, held something no one could name. His mane lifted in the breeze, his breath hot against the air. Jake held still, nodded once, and whispered, "No need to rush. You've waited 3 years. I can wait a few minutes more." The words seeped like cool water into the heat. Catherine heard them clearly, her chest tightening. Her husband had once spoken nearly the same before Tempest had bowed his head for the first time. The corral sank into tender suspense. No one knew what might happen, but all felt it. This was no contest for reward. It was a meeting of 2 souls. Jake let his shoulders ease, breathing out slowly. The exhale was soft, but strong enough for the stallion to hear a signal of calm. A few in the crowd unconsciously let out their own breath, as though drawn into the same rhythm. Tempest edged half a step nearer. Sunlight slanted across his eyes, casting a silver glimmer there. Jake didn't move. He knew in a horse's world, one wrong motion could shatter the fragile thread. So he left the space to the stallion, and then in silence, deep enough to hear grass tremble beyond the fence, Tempest dipped his head just slightly, but unmistakably. "A sign I accept your presence." The crowd stirred as if a ripple passed through them. An old woman folded her hands in prayer. Catherine let go of her sleeve, letting the wind lift her hair, her eyes glistening. Fear still clung, but now it mingled with fragile hope. Jake did not step closer. He only whispered voice, faintly trembling yet sure, "Thank you. We'll try when you're ready." And there, In the circle of gold dust, man and horse faced each other. Distance still between them, but trust had begun. Like two riverbanks waiting for a bridge to rise out of silence. Part 5. The First Touch. The afternoon sun had turned to honey pouring across Dry Creek Valley like a golden tide. Rays of light cut through the thin veil of dust, dressing the corral in a shimmering cloak. The air was still dry, still harsh, yet the silence was so deep that everyone could hear the beat of their own hearts. In the circle of sand, Jake Morrison stood motionless. He wasn't a statue, but the stillness about him made him seem like a stone marker, weathered by years of wind and time. His hands rested open at his sides, palms turned outward, as if he had laid down every burden, every guard. His gaze never left Tempest. The black stallion, tall, sleek, gleaming like obsidian in the afternoon light, stood only a few steps away. Power coiled beneath his muscles, his eyes dark and fathomless, holding the man's reflection within. Tempest drew a long breath, his chest swelling, each exhale streaming out in mist that melted into the golden air. Every breath seemed to ask, "Who are you? Are you worthy?" Jake dipped his head, barely more than an unspoken vow. Then his voice came low and husky, yet warm enough to slip through the dust and the wind. "No one will touch you, unless you allow it. I only wish to stand here if you'll let me." The tone was gentle, without demand, like wind drifting through cottonwood branches. The crowd beyond the rails held their breath. A few men frowned, not understanding why he hadn't acted yet. But Catherine Sterling understood. From the porch, she felt her shoulders ease. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to Tempest with such a voice, the voice of respect. Tempest circled ears, flicking forward then back, testing. His hooves struck the earth, kicking up thin trails of dust. He moved around Jake in widening arcs. The first circle kept distance only to watch. Jake turned with him, slow, measured, careful not to invade his space. Sweat traced down Jake's temples, but his gaze stayed steady. "I won't hurry," he murmured. "You've waited 3 years. I can wait minutes or hours." At those words, Catherine pressed a hand to her chest. 3 years since her husband had passed, since Tempest had let no one near. And now this man spoke the very number, as if destiny itself had answered. The crowd was hushed. Only the wind sighed through the rails, only fabric snapped against the sun, only hearts beat louder than before. A boy on his father's shoulders whispered, "Can horses really hear?" The father gave no reply, but his eyes stayed fixed, hungry to believe. Tempest closed the circle. 5 steps now. Jake didn't move, only lifted his right hand palm, open at his chest. He didn't reach, didn't press, just left it there, a silent invitation. "If you wish, come." The stallion halted, nostrils, flaring breath heavy and hot. His scent rolled on the wind, a warm hide, and the wild that could never be tamed. It carried Jake back to nights on the open range, when only horses had been honest companions. A long moment passed. Then Tempest stepped closer. 3 paces now. The crowd stirred, sharp intakes of breath rising. Catherine gasped, then held it back. Her husband had once stood like this, waiting, until Tempest chose to come of his own will. Jake whispered voice, rough and trembling, "Good boy. I know you're tired of men who boast. I don't want to win. I only want permission to stay here with you." Tempest snorted, then slowly lowered his head. His breath poured over Jake's open palm, burning hot against his skin. Jake's heart hammered, but he didn't pull away. He let the life in that breath sink into his hand, into his chest, reminding him that trust begins with something as small as a breath. The crowd fell utterly still. A single cough broke, then faded. Every gaze locked on the hand and the bowed head. Even the wind seemed to pause. Tempest exhaled the sound like a sigh after a long nightmare. Then he shifted, pressing his muzzle into Jake's palm. The touch was brief, but it held the weight of years. Catherine lifted a hand to her mouth, eyes wet. Something inside her broke free, like a spring bursting through stone. 3 years of waiting, 3 years of scorn, of watching men fall. And now the last treasure of her husband's life, the horse she had guarded alone, had chosen to touch another. Jake trembled, but he did not stroke or claim. He let his hand rest still, afraid to shatter the fragile miracle. Tempest lingered, then nudged gently, a soft nudge like a handshake. An old man by the fence murmured, "Never seen it. Never seen that horse do that with anyone." Jake closed his eyes a moment, letting the warmth of living hide fill his palm, the steady breath, the thrum of a strong heart. When he opened them, his voice was thick with truth. "I've been waiting for this moment too." The words rang in the air, like a bell in the night. Catherine heard, and she knew he wasn't speaking only to the horse. He was speaking to life itself, a life long broken, now stirred awake. Tempest did not turn away. He allowed Jake's hand to move slow and careful down the curve of his neck. The man's hand shook, but it was patient. Each inch was a new step in trust. The crowd felt it, their throats tightening. They knew real trust never rushed. A soft breeze carried the faint scent of lavender from Catherine's scarf. It mingled with the heat of horsehide and the dry dust, weaving a quiet hymn of the West, harsh yet tender. Tempest blinked slowly, then sighed, resting his head against Jake's shoulder. Jake bent his knees slightly to steady himself, then straightened, pressing his forehead to the stallion's mane. "Thank you for giving me this chance." Catherine's tears fell freely, glistening in the golden light. She did not hide them. They were proof that trust had begun to bloom in the heart of a horse, a man and a woman who had lived too long with loneliness. No one in the crowd dared disturb it. They only watched in silence, letting the moment carve itself deep, an open hand, a bowed head, and a world stilled to honor the first touch. Part 6. Mounting like the dawn. Evening settled over Dry Creek Valley, like a golden cloth laid across the prairie. The lowering sun spilled through the fence rails, stretching shadows long and crooked over the sand. Dust floated in the air, glowing like specks of gold dusted across the sky. Everything, the breath of men, the murmur of wind, slowed, as though the whole valley held its breath, waiting for a sacred moment. Inside the corral, Jake Morrison still stood beside Tempest. His calloused hand rested against the stallion's neck, feeling the faint tremors in the muscles beneath the black coat. It wasn't fear, it was the natural tension of a string, drawn tight, waiting for the right note to be played. Jake knew this was the threshold. One step further, and everything might be won or lost. He would not rush. In the West, every precious thing demanded time, crops, friendships, trust, and most of all, the consent of a free spirit. From his belt, Jake pulled a simple rope, not the polished saddles or fancy gear that swaggering cowboys showed off, just a loop of coarse cord tied neatly to serve as reins. He held it up where Tempest could see, hiding nothing, making no sudden move. His gesture said plainly, "This is all I have, and I will not use it to force you." The stallion flared his nostrils, ears pricked, high eyes shining in the amber light. Jake stopped waiting. Sweat rolled down his temple, mixing with dust salty on his lips. Still, he didn't wipe it away, didn't look aside. He waited until Tempest tilted his head and exhaled a long breath. That was the signal. Jake nodded gently, looping the rope across the stallion's neck, with the care of a priest laying ribbon on an altar. Tempest stiffened for a heartbeat, then loosened again. A ripple of murmurs swept the crowd. "He's letting him. Put the rope on." Jake laid his hand on the horse's mane and whispered, "Together now. Not me climbing on you, but us agreeing to move forward." He lifted his left foot, setting it into the loop like a stirrup. Every muscle in his body tightened, sweat soaking his shirt. Tempest flicked his ears, snorting. Instantly, Jake froze, holding still. He waited, pushing nothing. The corral was silent hearts pounding as if each belonged to the man in the ring. Seconds stretched like whole winters. Then Tempest sighed, his body loosening tail sweeping lightly through the dust. Only then did Jake move, easing his weight upward. He didn't leap like the others had, didn't wrench himself onto the horse's back. He mounted slowly, carefully, like sunrise, easing over the ridge, not rushed, but unstoppable. The stallion tensed as the weight settled, chest-heaving eyes fixed on the horizon. But he did not buck. He did not rear. He stood. Jake straightened, sitting tall, hands light on the simple rope. He didn't pull, didn't press. He only balanced steady as breath. The evening wind swept through, carrying the mingled scents of horsehide, dry dust, and sweat, woven into the quiet hymn of the West. A hush fell. Then, Tempest stepped. That first step shattered the wall of silence. Hooves thudded warm into the sand dust, curling in small circles. Jake moved with him, shoulders loose, back straight. One step, then another. The corral seemed to sway with every hoofbeat. The crowd exhaled as one. Some wiped tears from weathered cheeks. An old man's voice rasped, "It's like watching the sun come up." The words spread and heads nodded. For indeed, it was like dawn, solemn, radiant, gentle. On the porch, Catherine Sterling clasped her hands tight. Tears spilled freely, unhidden. In her heart, the moment was a dream come true. For 3 years, she had heard only the sound of bodies hitting sand, of bones cracking, of men cursing. But today, she heard something else, the steady rhythm of footsteps born of trust. Tempest circled the corral, not in fury as before, but slow and solemn, tracing a sacred round. Jake sat easy eyes, lit with calm focus, whispering soft words like prayers. "Good boy. Steady now. We're all right." Each word was a note, each step a beat, until horse and man wove a song together. No longer rider and beast, but two souls sharing rhythm. A boy pressed close to his mother and whispered, "It's like watching the sunrise at noon." The mother smiled, her eyes glistening too. Jake laid his hand gently on the stallion's neck and whispered, his voice trembling yet sure, "Thank you for trusting me." Tempest snorted deep and low, the sound of acceptance. He lengthened his stride, widening the circle, their shadows stretching and crossing over the golden sand. The crowd watched in reverent silence, knowing they had witnessed the impossible, a cowboy who mounted by respect and a horse who agreed by heart. Catherine wiped her tears, her smile shining through. In that fading light, she knew this was not merely the moment a man rode a wild horse. This was the dawn of something greater, the dawn of hope. Part 7. When the wind stood still, evening leaned toward sunset. The sky above Dry Creek Valley turned to copper red, streaked with slow drifting purple clouds, shawls of color draped across the far-off ridges. Inside the corral, the air grew thick, heavy, as though even the wind dared not stir, afraid to shatter the fragile moment being born. Jake Morrison sat steady on Tempest's back. The reins were nothing more than a simple rope carrying no power to force. Yet balance did not come from rope. It came from the agreement of two souls. Tempest did not rear, did not fight. He stood breathing deep ears forward, black eyes calm in a way no one had ever seen. Then, like a miracle begun with a heartbeat, Tempest stepped. The first circle was slow. Sand crunched beneath hooves, dust curling thin around his legs. Jake shifted his weight in rhythm, not pressing, not pulling. Every movement flowed like a small creek, following its bed, unforced, simply true. The crowd was silent at the rails. Many found themselves holding their breath as though they too were trying to keep balance. Catherine Sterling pressed her hands tight to her chest. In her tear-bright eyes, it wasn't just a cowboy riding, it was a memory reborn. She saw again her husband the last time he had ridden Tempest in this very circle, his eyes shining like sparks in a winter storm. Tempest eased into a trot. No sudden lurch, no warning. Each step was clean fluid. Jake tilted his body, lightly loosened his hands, letting himself drift into the rhythm. He was no longer riding a horse, he was gliding within an invisible song. The wind held still. The entire corral seemed to hold its breath. Only the steady beat of hooves sounded like the heartbeat of the whole valley. Then Tempest lifted into a canter. The movement rolled smooth as waves. Jake leaned with him, dark hair streaming back, eyes half closed. For that moment, he was no longer the scarred man hiding from war memories. He was part of a gentle storm, the very breath of freedom. 10 minutes slipped by like a single sigh. No one counted the seconds. All they knew was that time itself had paused. At times, Tempest surged faster, circling in a halo of glowing dust. Jake bent low, whispering into the wind, "That's it. Fly, partner." At times, the stallion slowed, testing, asking if the man would stay patient. And Jake was always there, silent hand resting on his neck, breathing in time with him. Catherine's tears spilled unchecked. In Jake, she saw her husband's gentleness, yet something new as well. A man broken by life, yet choosing to trust again. A man who did not seize, but asked permission. Emotion surged in her chest, trembling her shoulders like waves breaking against shore. The crowd began to murmur, not with mockery, but in reverent awe, as if standing at the edge of something sacred. An old man whispered, "Never thought I'd see that devil gentle." A young mother holding her child sighed softly. Maybe it was only waiting for the right one. In the circle of sand, Jake lifted his face, his eyes glowing in the sunset. He knew he was no longer alone. The scars of war, the nights of emptiness, in a line shack, the hollowness that had clung to him were all dissolving with each hoofbeat. He didn't need to forget. He only needed to remember he could still believe. Tempest slowed canter, to trot, trot to walk. Every change was smooth, chosen, never forced. When he halted in the center, the long shadow of twilight spilling across the sand, the watchers realized they had been holding their breath without knowing. From the porch, Catherine stepped forward. Her voice carried hoarse yet clear. 15 minutes. Jake blinked, puzzled. He muttered, "The challenge was 10. Catherine moved nearer, eyes shining with tears. "You've been on his back 15 minutes. No fall, no refusal. More than that, you've given him joy." The crowd stirred, then hushed again. They knew they had not seen a contest, but a small piece of history for their valley. Jake lowered his hand to Tempest's neck, whispering, "We did it." The stallion snorted, pressing his head into Jake's shoulder. A collective sigh rose from the fence, not of weariness, but of wonder. Catherine swallowed hard, her voice trembling. You don't know. For 3 years, I haven't seen this. In this very ring, my husband once rode him so. And today, you... Her words broke into tears. Jake bowed his head, answering low and rough, yet warm. I didn't come to win. I came to find if I could still believe. Catherine's gaze locked with his, and in that moment the wind stirred again. But no one noticed. What mattered was that for 15 minutes the wind itself had stood still while trust, hope, and perhaps love rose alive once more. Part 8. Refusing the gold. Sunset had come in full. The sky glowed like burning embers, spilling red light across the corral and turning the dust to copper fire. The crowd had begun to scatter boots, dragging whispers fading. No one laughed. No one jeered. They slipped away quietly, carrying with them a story to be told again at the saloon by the hearth in letters sent far and wide. The stranger rode Tempest 15 minutes and was never thrown. In the ring of sand, only 3 figures remained: the dust-covered cowboy, the flame-haired widow, and the black stallion like a piece of night. Jake Morrison had just stepped down. His legs trembled faintly, as if his body still echoed with the exaltation of the ride. Tempest lowered his head, exhaling a long breath, then pressed his muzzle to Jake's shoulder, a rare gesture of acceptance. Jake laid his calloused hand on the horse's neck and whispered, "You did well, partner. I was only lucky enough to be here." Catherine Sterling entered the corral, her skirt brushing the sand, her shoes powdered with dust. Tear streaks glimmered faint on her cheeks, but her eyes were bright, astonished, moved. In her hand was a small leather pouch, heavy with $50 in gold. She stopped a few steps away, opened the pouch, and extended her hand. The coins glowed red in the dying sun. Her voice was hoarse, but steady. $50 as promised. Jake looked at her hand, then at her face. For a moment, silence. He could hear the wind brushing through the rails, the scrape of a hoof in the dirt. Then he shook his head, his voice low and warm. "Keep it, ma'am. I didn't ride him for money." Catherine's eyes widened, gray-blue shining with disbelief. From the day she'd made the challenge, men had come only for those coins, enough to start a ranch, enough to change a life. Yet now, the only man who had succeeded refused. Not for money. She breathed wonder, and tears tangled in her voice. Jake set his hand against his chest, glancing at Tempest, then back at her. "No, I came here to see if I could still trust again. This horse doesn't need someone to beat him. He needs someone who will listen, and so do I. I don't need the gold, Catherine. What I need is to know I haven't lost the ability to believe in something." The words fell slowly, sinking into dust and timber and wind. Catherine's throat tightened. She remembered every face that had crossed this corral, boaster schemers, angry men walking away. Not one had ever said they did not want the gold. Her hand lowered. The pouch closed. The coins clinked faintly, the sound like a heavy door shutting on an old chapter. Tempest drew a deep breath, ears flicking, then stepped closer, pressing his head again to Jake's shoulder as if to agree. Jake smiled softly, hand on the stallion's neck. "See? He doesn't care about the gold either." Catherine's laugh broke through tears, shaking yet warm. She nodded, whispering, "Maybe. You're what I've been waiting for." The wind stirred, then sweeping through the corral, carrying the scents of hay, wood, horsehide, and a faint trace of lavender from Catherine's scarf. The heavy air lightened as though after a long rain. Jake lifted his eyes to hers. His gaze was no longer guarded, no longer closed. It was open, honest like a small flame, trembling yet warm. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I don't know what I have to offer. But if you need a hand, someone who can wait, someone who won't walk away, I can stay." Catherine's breath caught her hand trembling around the pouch. The shadows of 3 hard years lifted from her eyes. She stepped closer, her voice unsteady, but sure. "Stay, Jake Morrison. Not because I need a worker, but because I believe that both I and this horse need someone who knows real worth can't be bought with gold." Jake touched the brim of his hat, bowing his head. His heart pounded, but for the first time in years, it wasn't hollow. It was warm. It was healed. Tempest nickered the sound, echoing like a seal upon the pact. No contract, no coin, only trust. The sun slipped low, draping the corral in fiery red. And there they stood, the quiet cowboy, the steadfast widow, and the black stallion, the bond between them forged not by money, but by faith. Part 9. Staying. Sunset settled fully over Dry Creek Valley. The sky's red embers dimmed into deep violet, washing the wooden roof of Sterling Ranch in soft, solemn color. The corral gate closed behind them, hinges creaking long and low, like a song bidding farewell to an old chapter. The crowd had long since gone, leaving the yard in hushed stillness. Only the faint whisper of wind, the flap of chickens' wings in a distant coop, and the steady breath of Tempest by the fence remained. Jake Morrison walked beside Catherine toward the porch. Each step left boot prints pressed into the sand, mingled with the fresh marks of horse hooves. The air carried the resin scent of pine wood, laced with dust of the prairie, and a faint trace of lavender from Catherine's scarf. She stopped at the steps, her figure cast long in the last red glow. Her gray-blue eyes lifted to the weathered cowboy, her voice warm yet plain. "This ranch is too big for one woman. For 3 years, I've given all I had, but hands and feet have their limits. I need another pair of hands." Jake removed his hat, holding it against his chest. He didn't answer at once. His gaze traveled across the yard, the cattle pens, the water well, the barbed wire fence stretched over grassland, the wooden house that had stood through so many storms. He knew these labors well, mending fences, tending wounds in cattle, striking fires in the cold night. This was the shape of his life already. Catherine drew a breath and went on. "I'll pay fair wages. There's a cabin north of the pasture empty for years. It needs work, but with care, it could be a home. I want you to live there." Jake gripped his hat tighter. The word home trembled in him. For years his shelter had been a worn line shack with scorched coffee and rotting boards as his companions. A home. The thought felt so distant it made him pause. Catherine's eyes held his, her voice slow and steady. "But there's one condition. Tempest will be part of the work, not as a beast to be broken, but as a companion. He needs someone who listens. And I believe that someone is you." At the fence, Tempest gave a low nicker, the sound rolling like agreement. Jake turned, meeting the stallion's gaze, black eyes reflecting the violet sky. In that moment, he knew this was no burden. It was an invitation of destiny. He smiled faintly, bowing his head. "Ma'am, I've spent years running from the past. I never thought I'd find a place I belonged. But if this land, if you and this horse will have me, then I believe I've found home." Catherine's breath caught her eyes shimmering. His words touched the loneliness she had hidden for 3 long years. She gripped the porch post to steady herself, while inside a long closed door cracked open, letting light flood in. The moment stilled. Wind drifted by, lifting her hair gently. Tempest stepped closer, to the railhead, bowed, as though waiting to hear the final word. Jake spoke, voice deep and unhurried, each word falling like stones into a quiet well. "I will stay, Catherine Sterling. Not just to work. I'll stay, because this place makes me feel I am no longer wandering." Catherine nodded, a smile spreading like a second sunrise at day's end. She whispered clearly, "Welcome to Sterling Ranch, Jake Morrison." Tempest lifted his head and whinnied, the sound echoing through the valley like a bell announcing a beginning. Jake looked up at the sky, red fading into indigo, the first star flickering to life. And in his heart, another star shone, the certainty that after years of drifting, he had finally found home. Part 10. A new dawn. October came, and the cottonwoods turned gold, their leaves scattering along the road into Sterling Ranch. Each breeze sent them swirling into circles like nature's own blessings written on the air. Overhead, the sky shifted from copper red to deep violet, the whisper of winter close at hand. But this day, the valley glowed with warmth, for it was the day of a wedding. The townsfolk had arrived early, bringing simple gifts: a fresh loaf of bread, a jar of honey, a bouquet of wildflowers, a bottle of sweet apple cider, all laid upon a long table draped in white cloth. No silver, no jewels, no grandeur, only kindness. Children darted about with laughter. Grown men chopped wood, fed the fire, and set a pot of stew to simmer for the evening feast. Sterling Ranch shone bright. The porch was dressed in garlands of yellow leaves with bundles of dried corn hanging in rows. Catherine herself tied each ribbon, her hands trembling, her eyes shining. 3 years after sorrow had darkened this house, the porch once again welcomed a ceremony, her wedding day. Catherine Sterling stepped out from the small room, wearing her mother's gown. The silk had aged to ivory, the seams worn, but lovingly kept. Around her neck lay her grandmother's string of faded pearls. Her hair was gathered back a few strands, brushing her cheek in the autumn wind. Her face carried both the tremble of a bride and the quiet peace of a woman who had found her harbor at last. Jake Morrison stood waiting on the porch. He wore a crisp white shirt, plain trousers pressed neat, and boots polished to shine. His old trail-worn coat hung over a chair set aside with the wandering years it represented. On his chest, Catherine had pinned a sprig of wild purple bloom. His face was solemn, but in his dark eyes burned a light, seen only at daybreak hope. The old minister arrived by wagon, his Bible worn at the spine. His voice, rough but warm, carried steady through the wide air. The guests gathered close, hushed as though inside a chapel. The wind stirred softly through the leaves, their rustling a choir of blessing. When Catherine and Jake joined hands, sunlight broke through the clouds, wrapping them in a golden veil. Her hands small and work-roughened, his broad and calloused from long years. Yet when their fingers laced, they fit as if they had always belonged. At the minister's final words, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," a sound rang out, cutting through the air. Tempest the black stallion whinnied long and strong. He stood tall by the fence mane, tossing head lifted high. His cry echoed across the valley, rolling to the distant mountains. The crowd laughed, some wiping tears. An old woman whispered, "The horse bears witness too." Catherine broke into sobs, covering her face, shoulders shaking with joy. Jake bent close and whispered, "Even he agrees." Afterward, the guests gathered at the long table. Children laughed, passing sweet cakes hand to hand. A boy played harmonica, its gentle tune weaving with the crackle of stew boiling over the fire. Adults raised cups of cider, clinking them in blessing. No one spoke of grief past. They spoke of harvests to come, of foals to be born, of trust that Sterling Ranch would now be shared by two. Jake sat among them, looking around, with a feeling he thought he'd never know again belonging. He was no longer the solitary cowboy in a line shack, eating cold bread in silence. He had a wife, a home, and a community that opened its arms. Winter came, and the cabin on the northern pasture glowed with lamplight. Jake repaired the roof, rebuilt the hearth, and made it a home. Each morning, smoke from his coffee pot curled into the sky, a signal to Catherine that she was no longer alone. Spring followed, greening the fields. Tempest's colts ran free, trained by Jake with the same language he had given their sire, patience and respect. The name of Sterling Ranch spread the place where horses are taught by trust. Years later, on a spring morning, Catherine opened her door to see Jake sitting on the porch steps, coffee steaming in his hand, eyes resting on the meadow. Tempest, now old and silvered, stood in the pasture main, stirring in the dawn breeze. The sun rose, laying gold across the ranch. Jake turned and smiled at her, a smile of peace that carried everything faith restored, wounds healed, hope that would last. Catherine sat beside him, leaning her head upon his shoulder. The wind stirred again, but no longer the lonely wind of old. It was the wind of a new dawn, the dawn of love. Epilogue. The circle continues. Sunset poured honey over the fields, bathing all of Dry Creek Valley in warm shades of gold and red. A late flock of birds lifted into the sky, winging in a cross-angled line toward the far mountains. The scents of dry grass and evening cook fires mingled, weaving together a quiet hymn that only the West could sing. On the wooden porch of Sterling Ranch, Catherine and Jake sat side by side. The old chair creaked beneath their weight, but its sound was steady and gentle, like the heartbeat at the end of a long day. Catherine leaned her head against her husband's shoulder, a steaming cup of coffee in her hand. Jake's strong arm wrapped around her as his eyes lingered on the pasture where Tempest stood. The black stallion was old now, his mane streaked with silver. Yet when he lifted his head and whinnied, the sound carried far clear as a bell announcing the beginning of another cycle. In the stillness, both Catherine and Jake smiled. They knew, though, years might take away, strength, trust, and freedom endure. At the ranch gate, a figure appeared, a young cowboy, thin eyes, lost and searching, leading a limping horse. He removed his hat, voice shy. I heard, "This is a place for men who treat horses with kindness instead of the whip. That's all I know how to do. I've never been much good with people." Jake and Catherine exchanged a glance. In their eyes was recognition, as if seeing themselves years ago. Jake smiled, his voice deep and warm. "You've come to the right place. Here we don't teach horses by force. We learn to listen. If you're willing, there's work for you at this ranch, and maybe more than just work." Catherine nodded, her smile gentle. "Tempest will test you just as he's tested everyone, but don't be afraid. If you're honest, he'll know." The young man lowered his head, a spark of hope lighting in his gaze. From the fence, Tempest whinnied again, a sound like an invitation. The three of them stood in silence, looking out across the pasture now painted in the colors of dusk. On the porch, Catherine and Jake's hands intertwined. They understood the circle of healing did not end with them. It would continue widening like the sun rising new each morning. In the West, true strength is not in breaking, but in listening. Trust turns the storm into shelter. Before we begin, next time comment your city below. And when this story ends, please rate it from 0 to 10. Subscribe so you never miss the next Western love that helps you sleep.